All right, class, it is time for your Unit 3 review video on a very windy morning here on my deck, so you might be able to pause the video from time to time as my hair blows around, and I guess you can have fun with that. All right, we need to do Unit 3, and again, it may take us 2 videos to get through this. Let's look at question number 1, or short question number 1. How did popular consumer products of the 1920s change the social and economic life in the United States, and how did it impact national identity through marketing and advertising? This is a really good example of a question, and think about technology. I mean, again, think of how much cell phones have changed our patterns of behavior. You can call up music on your iPhone and have thousands of songs to choose from. We're watching less, or we're listening to less radio because now our phone is our radio. So think of how technology changes our patterns of behavior. Think about how technology can connect us in ways that you couldn't connect before, but also think about how it changes the way we behave in maybe some negative ways. So for example, with cell phones, we can communicate with people instantly around the world, but now fewer of us talk to people face to face, including our neighbors. I'm willing to bet many of us back in the 1920s would have known all of our neighbors by name and known them really well. Today, very few of us can identify the names of the people that live in the homes just immediately surrounding us. So let's look at these consumer goods of the 1920s. You've got cars, telephones, washing machines, refrigerators, radios, electric irons, and vacuum cleaners. Now, I'm not going to do this for every one of these. You can do it on your own. Again, this is a review video. You have to study on your own. But let's just take telephones. Being able to call people. The number of letters written are going to decrease. You can call people halfway around the United States or across town that you would only see once in a great while. You can now talk to them on a daily basis. Think of how cars are going to allow cities to spread out because people can travel further distances now. They can shop, they can worship, they can work, they can live far away from each other, so we can spread and stretch things out. It's also going to increase our dependency on gasoline, just like telephones are going to decrease our need to send mail. And wait till we get email. Or better yet, refrigerators. With refrigerators, we don't need to shop for groceries every day because you can't, there's no such thing as leftovers before refrigerators. I mean, you could have an ice box, but they were unreliable and limited. It'd be like having a very small cooler when you go camping. You can keep a few things overnight, but that's about it. And daily ice delivery in the height of summer is going to be very expensive and limited. So again, think of how these things, or things that help you clean the house. You know, one thing that's weird with all these new inventions like electric irons and vacuum cleaners and, you know, the things that we have that make a modern dishwashers, the average American spends as much time doing housework now as they did back in the 1920s. So how's that possible? Our houses have gotten bigger. So we made our lives easier, and then we just complicated them again. We talked and had that article about the Linns, the first people to start to study how does new patterns of behavior change our old definitions and jobs. You know, as more refrigerators and washing machines become possible, and electric irons and vacuum cleaners, the number of domestic workers plummets, which used to be the #1 employment category amongst women. Advertising, as the radio comes in, and someday in the future the television set, but that's not another for a few units. But the radio changes the way we advertise and market, and commercials. And buying the same product across the United States can make us feel similar to each other. Just like you say iPhone or, you know, Samsung, and people around the world know what you're talking about, probably have one of those 2 products in their hands, or maybe the new Google phone. All right, let's look at question number 2. How did flappers change or challenge tradition? They also changed it. Relate this to the concept of generational rebellion then, and how you can see it now. Now realize for this question, if chosen in class, you need to do both. Then, mostly then, but then throw in some examples of now. So I threw in two pictures here for visualizations because for some of you that's very important. Here's a woman in a traditional Victorian dress. You'll notice that the dress line is at the ground. You'll notice that the neckline is at the neck. And, you know, sleeves are fully covered the arm, and women even wore gloves to hide their wrists. Well, you look at a flapper, and you can see their knees, let alone their ankles. And you see plunging necklines, maybe not plunging necklines by today's definitions, but it was shocking back then. If you grew up in this kind of a situation and environment and you saw a group of flappers walking down the street, you'd be thinking, oh my God, what's wrong with these people? And they, you know, they had their dresses, which we already described. They bobbed their hair. They wore makeup, particularly bright lipstick. They smoked in public, and they listened to jazz music. And by the way, cigarette companies really jumped on board with this. They started featuring cigarettes in movies, and they kind of fed into that generational rebellion and actually made smoking a way to be rebellious. Well, of course, that's going to lead to lung cancer and emphysema and a whole bunch of other negative consequences. You know, here's where we can get into an argument. Is generational rebellion good or bad? How can you see it today? Now, as a father, I can tell you, and also as somebody who does remember being a teenager, you look at me and probably think that isn't possible, but it is. Rebellion is good in moderation. I'll put it that way. Challenging your boundaries is a part of being a teenager, because a teenager is the point at which, you know, who am I versus am I only the way I am because my parents made me that way? The example I gave in class was fashion. You know, I'm willing to bet up until a certain grade, maybe it was kindergarten, first grade, second grade, your parents set out your clothes for you and you just put them on, and we're pleased to do that. You didn't think about it. I doubt many of you today would let your parents pick out your clothes for you, because that's a personal expression. So bouncing up against boundaries, how do I know I'm the way I am because my parents made me that way versus I want to be that way? You know, just like as I joked in class, I remember defying my parents. And my gosh, my dad was a U.S. history teacher who coached baseball. Sometimes we become our parents. And certainly I have figured that out over time. Although if you told me that when I was a teenager, I would have said, no way. So how can you see that today? How do you see examples of generational rebellion? And you know, it's not jazz music today, so what's an example from today? It's not, you know, flapper dresses today. What is it today? And, you know, is it good or bad? So relate the flappers to the 1920s and realize how this changes identity in many ways. Question number 3. Which workers won during the 1920s economic boom, and which ones lost? What explains why unions lost so much ground during this time period? Give an example of how you can see winners and losers in today's economy. And again, if this question is chosen at random on the day of the test, you will need to do a little bit of today. Most of this question, of course, is in the 1920s. I want some transference today. Well, you know, we've got a lot of new technology in the 1920s. You've got radios. You've got, you know, electric irons and, you know, refrigerators. Think about that. Refrigerators means you don't need an iceman to come every day and deliver ice. Those people are obsolete. If fewer people are sending letters, we need fewer people at the post office than otherwise we would have needed. So for every new piece of technology, you create winners and losers. We've talked a lot in class about automation. Just think about how driverless cars are going to make whole groups of people obsolete. We won't need them anymore. So, you know, if driverless cars fully hit the economy, and we don't need taxi drivers in the future. It isn't like a taxi driver who's now unemployed can just go to another town and be a taxi driver. They're obsolete. Or cashiers with the new Amazon on the Go store in Seattle. You know, when that goes national, think of how many cashiers we just won't need anymore. I'm emphasizing today for a reason before we get to the 1920s. Universal truth. When new technology comes out, it always makes lower skilled jobs obsolete first, although it does eventually move into the higher skilled areas. And that's true in the 1920s. So notice the losers. I'm just going to jump to the losers. Semi and unskilled workers, coal miners, textile workers, And you know, 40% of low and semi-skilled workers are living in poverty, even though they have full-time jobs. I mean, think about that. 40% of workers, and they represent the semi and unskilled workers, are living in poverty, and they're working 50, 60 hours a week. The winners, skilled workers, construction workers, particularly in new forms of construction, steel, for example. Railroad workers, although that's about to change with the advent of the automobile. New consumer product factories. So if you're working in a, let's say, Ford auto plant, you're going to be making a lot more money than if you're working in a factory making horseshoes. So the factories making the radios, the refrigerators, they're going to see a huge influx in business. And, you know, these workers that are in the more skilled areas, the high demand areas, they're going to start to see for the first time in American history sick days and stock options and life insurance. And one of the reasons that unions see a decrease is with so many jobs becoming obsolete. And a lot of those jobs, like the coal miners and the textile workers, were highly unionized. They're seeing a decrease in work. And also with so many jobs being made obsolete, there is a fear, there is a demand for jobs, and the idea is that maybe unions are making wages too high and now those jobs are uncompetitive. And there's so many people seeking work that it's harder to get people to demand higher salaries. And also remember, connection to a different question, there's a fear of communism in the 1920s. And communism and the communist revolution in Russia started amongst the workers. Are these unions communists? So there's a lot of different reasons why unions are on the decline, as well as Sacco and Vanzetti, as well as some of the violent strikes or the police strike in Boston. Question number 4, what were the jobs and professions women routinely occupied during the 1920s, and how was this an example of discrimination? This is going to be a pretty short question, and I kind of color-coded it. Here's the skilled workers that women did. So you've got secretaries, typists, filing clerks, bank tellers, unskilled, department clerks. These are the more unskilled jobs. Although it does, require some skills to be a secretary and a typist. I'm not discounting that. But as compared to teachers, nursing, social workers, and librarians, where you have to know a foreign language, for example, or nursing, where you've gone, and learned a lot of medical knowledge, these are the more skilled jobs where women are going to make more money. These are the more unskilled jobs where women are going to make less money. And note, though, even amongst the skilled jobs, women are nurses, they're not doctors. Women are, secretaries. They're not the boss. And you also have the League of Women Voters being created and the Shepard-Towner Act, which you should reference in this question as well. So the idea is to make the break between high-skilled and low-skilled jobs, but even within the higher-skilled jobs, there's discrimination. Women are being it's legal to discriminate against people up until this point. That won't be made really until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Discrimination was not only possible, it was the norm. Question number 5, how did the advent of superstars change culture? And how did mass media create the news superstar? We've always had superstars or people that were very well known in the 1800s and the 1700s, but really having radio and having movies is going to fundamentally change that. So, we have Rudolph Valentino, one of the first movie stars. You've got Charles Lindbergh, a Minnesotan, who flies across the Atlantic Ocean. So an aviator and an innovator. You've got a boxer, Jack Dempsey. You've got Charlie Chaplin, the first millionaire in Hollywood, or Babe Ruth. You can now hear the crack of the bat when Babe Ruth hits a home run. Babe Ruth is much more likely to be a superstar when you can hear his accomplishments. You can have stage actors who were very well known in the 1800s or the 1700s, but if you can have a film actor that everyone across the United States can simultaneously see them perform, even though they're not in person, but making 10 cents a ticket to have millions of people at a time see a movie versus $10 a ticket to see an actor live on stage. You can make a lot more money off of millions of people each buying a 10-cent ticket. So this is going to change the way people see things, and you can create these superstars. But also notice it's a bit separated. We can all hear Babe Ruth, but we can't all see him. We can all watch Charlie Chaplin, but we're not actually seeing him. We're seeing an image of him. And obviously today with computers, and I'm thinking of YouTube, how YouTube is changing the definition of superstars today. You know, there are people who have more subscribers and more viewers per week than the #1 rated TV show. So even today, we're changing the definition of what a superstar is. The internet and YouTube sensations have had an impact on that, just like Charles Lindbergh did or Jack Dempsey did. So realize and make the connection to new technology. And these national superstars are starting to demand national salaries. Just like movie stars today get paid $30 million a movie, and it only takes 3 months to make them. Or an athletic star like Joe Mauer, who makes $24 million a year playing baseball. Question number 6, compare and contrast the view of government held by Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. How are they similar? How are they different? So we have 2 presidents, and remember, Coolidge takes over for Harding after he passes away, and then we've got Herbert Hoover, who's president after Coolidge decides not to run for re-election in 28. Calvin Coolidge really was a strong proponent of laissez-faire, government hands-off. The less government has to do with everything, the better. The smaller government is, the better. And he passed the Revenue Act of 1926, in which he decreases income taxes, he raises the tariff. So it's a little bit of returning to the time before the progressive movement, late 1800s. He's also going to cut the powers of the Federal Trade Commission. Remember, the Federal Trade Commission, talked about this in our first unit with the progressive era, excuse me, is the police force to find businesses that are violating trade laws that might be monopolies and the like. Well, obviously, if you found out today that the state of Minnesota was going to cut the number of police officers by 50%, and all of the police officers were people that have formerly had lots of speeding tickets, then you're going to probably bet they're going to be less likely to pull you over. And there's going to be fewer of them to pull you over even if they wanted to. So putting a lot of pro-business people in the FTC and decreasing the number of them, there's less likelihood that a company is going to get caught. So it's really returned to the older times of the 1880s, the Gilded Age, the time period before the progressive movement. So really small government. Now, Herbert Hoover agreed with Coolidge in a lot of ways, but he didn't like the complete hands-off. He agreed with the FTC powers being cut. He agreed with higher tariffs. He agreed with decreasing income taxes, particularly on the wealthiest Americans. This is the one place he kind of disagreed. And he believes in something called associationalism. And what it means is the government should definitely be hands-off, but the government should play an active role in getting different people in the room talking and let them decide to work together. But the government should build those bridges. The government should get those people together to work together and solve the nation's problems. So the government shouldn't solve your problems, but the government should help businesses build lines of communication to solve their own problems. And that is government involvement. It's not a lot because you're just kind of nudging people together, and if they don't want to get married, they don't have to get married. But at least you're trying to move them. You aren't actively trying to get that to happen. I'll tell you what, we're going to hold off on question number 7, and we'll make that a part of part 2 of the Unit 3 review.